Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. John tried to dissuade Jesus, saying, "I should be baptized by you, and yet you come to me." But Jesus replied, "Leave it this way for now. We must do this to complete fully God's justice." So John reluctantly agreed. Immediately after Jesus had been baptized and was coming up out of the water, the sky suddenly opened up, and Jesus saw the Spirit of God descending as a dove and hovering over him. The Gospel of Christ. Please be seated. When the dove had descended, our gospel text tells us that a voice from the heavens said, "This is my own, my beloved, on whom my favor rests." On Monday, Western Christendom celebrated Epiphany as we heralded the arrival of wise folk from the East, from a place we now call Iran. By Wednesday, the world was mourning the crash of Ukrainian Airlines Flight 752 over the skies of Iran. By Friday, it was clear that the crash was no accident, that 176 people were murdered by some not-so-wise folk from the East in retaliation for the assassination of the most celebrated of Iranian generals. By Saturday, pundits, folks who claim to be wise, continued to argue over who to blame. Was Iran totally responsible, or does the orange ruler who sits on the most powerful throne on the planet ultimately carry the blame for plunging our world into madness? Today, still reeling from the reality that so many of the victims of this insanity were our very own kin, returning to Canada after visiting families and friends. Today, Canadians and Iranians are united in grief. Grief at the loss of life, grief at the apparent inevitability of war as systems of domination clash. Today, we gather to do what Christians do on the Sunday after Epiphany. We gather to remember our baptism through the stories told by our ancestors about the baptism of Jesus. What possible wisdom, comfort, or challenge can this story of a baptism which happened in the Jordan River nearly 2,000 years ago offer to us on a day like today? Not much. Not much, that is, if we choose to remember this story the way the church all too often remembers this story. For centuries, the church has adopted a kind of collective amnesia when it comes to baptism. We have chosen to forget the power of this story to inspire resistance to the very systems which continue to prevent us from living in peace. We have forgotten so very many of the contours of this story, which, if remembered, drag us out of our preoccupation with our own selfish needs toward a lifestyle of resistance to what has become the status quo. Where once the story of Jesus' baptism inspired his followers to deny allegiances to the powers that be in order to take upon themselves a new way of being in the world, generations of amnesia have left us marching in lockstep to the drumbeat of violence, even as we claim allegiance to the Prince of Peace. So what have we 21st century followers of Jesus forgotten about the story of Jesus' baptism in the first century? Well, for starters, we have forgotten that our first century ancestors risked everything when they chose to be baptized. Jesus' contemporaries lived under the oppression of not one, but two domination systems. Under the domination of what was the mightiest empire the world had ever seen, first-century people living in Palestine, whether they be Jew or Gentile, were required on pain of death to swear allegiance to Rome. The act of swearing allegiance was called in Latin sacramentum. Our word sacrament comes from the word sacramentum, which means to vow or to swear an oath or to pledge allegiance. My, how things have changed. Today in the church, a sacrament is a rite which is celebrated as a sort of thin place where the holy, the sacred, meets the ordinary. In the Lutheran Church, a sacrament is defined as a rite which includes both holy and ordinary. Two things are necessary in our tradition in order for a rite to be called a sacrament. We need the ordinary stuff of the earth, the visible means of grace, if you will, and second, the injunction from Jesus to do this. In our tradition, we have only two rites, which are called sacraments. One is baptism, and the other is communion. Baptism, water, the ordinary stuff, and the injunction of Jesus, who is reported to have said, "Go therefore and baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." And communion, bread and wine, the visible means, and Jesus' words, "Do this in remembrance of me." Our tradition's celebration of both these rites has radically changed over the centuries. Both rites have tended to focus upon the experience of individuals rather than the impact upon the community or communities in which these rites are celebrated. These days, baptism has become little more than a nice little rite of passage with precious little power to transform the life of its participants. But in the first century, this sacramentum of baptism was enough to bring a death sentence down upon the heads of those who partook of the waters of baptism. The act of baptism was an act of resistance. Resistance to the empire, the powerful empire of Rome, and resistance to the powers of the temple who collaborated with their Roman overlords. Every person living under the Pax Romana was under no illusion that pledging allegiance to anyone other than Caesar was an act of sedition punishable by death. For as far as the powers that be were concerned, Caesar is Lord. Caesar was not a name, but a title. We would say king, but not a king like we think of kings, but rather a king who is the ultimate authority on earth. And Rome's ultimate authority is Caesar, the Caesar. Caesar is Lord. Everyone living under Roman domination was required to sacramentum, to pledge allegiance, to take an oath, proclaiming Caesar as Lord, Caesar as ultimate authority. Jewish inhabitants of the Roman Empire were given no choice but to pledge allegiance or to die. Thousands chose death, and the Romans crucified them, actually crucified them. The rotting corpses of the thousands of Jews and Gentiles who refused to proclaim Caesar as Lord created the kind of stink intended to terrorize the oppressed into submission. And submit most of them did. Even the purveyors of power who walked the hallways of the sacred temple were dominated in ways which co-opted them into a system which held the whole Pax Romana together. But every domination system has its resistors. Take John the Baptist, for example. John was the son of the temple priest Zechariah. As a temple priest, Zechariah would have collaborated with the Romans. He was a respectable member of the established order. And in those days, a son took on the occupation of his father. The expectation was that John would also become a temple priest, a member of the status quo, the establishment, the powers that be. But John abandoned the temple, rejected the establishment, and went out into the desert. And then he went down by the river Jordan, the very river his ancestors had crossed over from slavery into the promise of freedom. And down by the riverside, John conducted very public sacramentums. John's fame spread far and wide as a notorious resistor. John became the Baptist, and Jesus joined this resistance. Down into the water Jesus went in an act of resistance, which in and of itself denied the authority of Caesar and the empire of Rome and proclaimed allegiance to a new kind of empire, the Basileia ton Theon, which we all too often translate as the kingdom of God, but which is more accurately translated as the authority of the divine, or kingdom of love. For if Jesus taught us anything, Jesus taught us that God is love, and the authority which Jesus pledged his allegiance to was the authority of that love, an authority which is all about relationships. That's why we say kingdom. The word kin means related. The kingdom of the ultimate authority is the kingdom of love, a place where it's all about the quality of relationships, the quality of our relationships to one another, and the quality of our relationship to the one who is beyond us. That's why for 3 centuries, the followers of Jesus of Nazareth's way of being in the world would risk everything to go down to the river and wash themselves clean of their bondage to empire, which felt like death to them. And then they would rise up out of the waters of life as newborn citizens of the kingdom of love, no longer bound to the ways of the empire, the ways of violence and death, but free to pursue the love which is the ultimate authority, the love that is God. Baptism was, for 3 centuries, the ultimate act of resistance to the powers that be. And then it was not. Somewhere around 313, there was a different Caesar sitting upon the throne of Rome, a Caesar who went by the name of Constantine. And the powers of Rome were on the wane. And Caesar Constantine was looking for a way to unite the empire, and somehow, I wish I had time to go into all of that, but suffice it to say, somehow the fledgling movement known as the Followers of the Way, or the Followers of the Christ, fit the bill. They were just what Constantine was looking for. And over the course of a few decades, Christianity went from an outlawed religion to the official religion of the Roman Empire. They say that power corrupts, and indeed power corrupted Christianity. Where once Christians pledged allegiance to Jesus' way of being and lived a nonviolent life as pacifists, refusing to take up arms, refusing to resort to violence. Now they were the official religion of Rome. And Christians felt free to join the military. Indeed, they held the cross up as a standard to march into war behind. And the rest, as they say, is history. So what can the story of Jesus' baptism offer to us? We who stand in the ruins of the fragile peace of empire. We who daily pledge our allegiance to systems of domination which ensure authority, the authority of the almighty dollar. We who struggle to be kin to one another. We who seek to know the one who is the ultimate authority. On this day, when we remember the baptism of Jesus, perhaps we can also remember our own baptisms. And for those who have not yet been baptized, perhaps together we can anticipate a new way of understanding baptism, which isn't really new at all. Perhaps we can celebrate baptism as an act of resistance. Now, in a few minutes, we will participate in an affirmation of baptism rite, and I will dip the ordinary greenery into the ordinary water, and I will engage in some holy splashing. And when the water falls upon you, and trust me, it's going to fall on every one of you. We're all going to get wet. When you feel the water, remember that baptism is an act of resistance. Think about the many ways in which your lives have been co-opted by the powers that be. Think about how much allegiance you have to the status quo. And think about who or what is your ultimate authority. Do you belong to empire? Do you pledge allegiance to wealth and power? Do you march in lockstep with systems that dominate through violence? Do you limit your kin to those who serve your own selfish needs? Or can you take the dangerous step of actually feeling the waters of life touch you? Dare you resist? Dare you pledge your allegiance to the ultimate authority who is love? Dare you resist by proclaiming that love is the ultimate authority? Do you have the courage to remember or to anticipate your baptism as an act of resistance? An act once taken will require the kind of kinship which empowers love to be the ultimate authority. Do you have the courage to follow Jesus' way of being in the world? I know that for me, that kind of resistance is frightening. That kind of resistance is, as they say where I come from, that kind of resistance scares the bejesus right out of me. Well, the good news is that this kind of resistance does not depend on me or on you. Baptism was never meant as an individual sacramentum. When we rise up out of the waters of life, we rise into a community of believers whose ultimate authority is love, the kingdom of love. When our ultimate authority is love, then compassion is our guide as we seek justice for everyone who is oppressed, for everyone who is marginalized, understanding that justice is what love looks like in the world. When our ultimate authority is love, everyone is our kin, and peace is achieved not through violence, selfishness, or greed, but through justice for all our kin. The empire we serve is the kingdom of love. So together, let us sacramentum. Let us pledge our allegiance to love. Let us rise from the waters to be love in the world, a world so desperately needing lovers who are willing to resist the powers that be for the sake of kinship. Let it be so among us. Let us empower one another to resist. Let us proclaim that love is our ultimate authority. Indeed, love is the ultimate authority. Let it be so. Amen.